All right, hello everyone. I hope that you guys are doing great. So within the previous lecture, within the previous few lectures, as you know, we have covered up all of the different types of threats that an auditor can face within his practical life, which stop him from following the fundamental principles of ethics. Now, as we have studied those, I told you within the previous lecture as well that now we will be continuing towards doing questions and answers from the Kaplan kit. Now, within this specific lecture, as we are going to move towards the past exam questions that have been given within your Kaplan kit, the first thing that you need to remember is how to solve the ethics related questions within the exam. Now, specifically those questions which ask you to identify the threats and give safeguards against them. Now, there is a question within your Kaplan kit as well. The name of the question is Peach Corporation. I just want to go towards the question part C. Now, if you look at part C, it asks you to identify and explain two ethical threats which may affect the independence of Apricot and Corporation for the audit of Peach Corporation, and the part 2 states for each threat recommend an appropriate safeguard to reduce the threat to an acceptable level. Now, wherever you see a question of ethics which asks you to identify ethical threats and give safeguards against it, whether they are two separate options or whether it is written in one single paragraph, the question is written and there is a comma here and the examiner says also give the safeguards against it, whether they are two separate options, one option asks you to identify the ethical threats and the other option asks you to identify safeguards, or it is a single option, the answer will always be given or the written within your exam in this specific way. So this is the way that you will always write down your answer. First of all, within your exam you will create a table as we have done within the CCG question as well. On one side the heading would be the threats and on the other side the heading would always be safeguards. Now, in order to write down the threats, first of all, always remember, just like the CCG questions, the code of corporate governance questions, you will be given a story within the exam for ethical threat as well, and by reading every single line you will have to identify any kind of ethical threat that the auditor is facing. Now, how do you explain your ethical threats? The first thing that you will have to do within threats is to explain the identified threat from the scenario in your own words. You will have to write down the threat in your own words. You will have to write down what is happening within the scenario, already written down within the scenario, but only in your own words. Now, the second thing that you will have to do, the second thing will be to link the thread and also mention the thread as well. So what I mean by this is that, for example, if you identify that there is a threat of fee dependency, you will have to write down this threat or this would create a fee dependency threat which falls within self-interest, familiarity or intimidation, whatever is linked with that specific threat that we identify. You will have to mention the type of threat and the type of example as well. If you are not able to mention the type of example, there is no issue in that, but you have to mention the type of threat that this circumstance is going to create for you. We will also do the question and I'll explain how it is done basically. So for example, if there is a fee dependency threat, how would you would write it down? This would create a fee dependency threat and would be linked to self-interest threat for the auditor. This is how you will write it down. Number 3 would be, from the threat examples which we have studied, explain what will happen adverse for the audit team if the safeguard is not applied. So for example, if fee dependency threat is not reduced, what was the adverse thing that would happen for the auditor itself? Obviously, in the long term, they are going to lose their independence, but we can't just say in every single type of threat that the auditor is going to lose their independence if the threat continues and if no safeguard is applied. No, you will have to properly explain the reason or the situation in the future that is going to occur if this threat is not reduced or if the safeguard is not applied. Now, in the case of fee dependency, what is going to happen in the future? What adverse thing is going to happen for the auditor? The adverse thing would be that because the auditor now would believe that if they identify any kind of misstatements, the audit client can stop their previous year's audit fee or even delay their audit fee, and hence the auditor is less likely to identify any kind of misstatements within the financial statements for the current year audit. So this is something that you will mention in your own words as well. Now, coming towards the safeguard, a safeguard is always something that you write down that you would actually do within your practical life as well. Now, within the previous lectures, I have properly explained this again and again, that safeguard, and even within CCG, Do not write down a generic safeguard. Write down a safeguard that you can properly link with the scenario, with the type of threat that you have identified. For example, for fee dependency, what was the appropriate types of safeguard that we could use? The appropriate type of safeguard was that before continuing the current year's audit, first you have to agree with the client that either they should pay a partial payment or full payment for the previous year's audit. And if they are unable to make even a partial payment at bare minimum, you will have to agree with the audit client a payment plan. Once that has been agreed, only then you should continue this year's audit, so that the intimidation and the self-interest threat is reduced. Now, this is how you will write down the safeguard here as well. Now, always remember the threat which is explained within these 3 points will be for 1 marks. The examiner will give you 1 marks for it. I've written it down here as well. And the safeguard that you will write down will also be for 1 mark. So, in short, every single threat that you identify, explain it within these 3 points and write down a proper safeguard against it. It will give you 2 marks within the exam. Now, moving towards this specific question, Peach Corporation, we can see that the examiner has told us to identify 2 ethical threats. This means for every single ethical threat, on the threat side, first we will have to write down the 3 points, and then on the safeguard side, we will have to write down 1 point, and for these things we will receive 2 marks. This means that in total these 2 portions should be of 4 marks, and as we can see, yes, these 2 portions are for 4 marks. Now let's move towards the question and try to solve the question itself. Let's try to read the question, try to identify first of all what are the ethical threats in this case and what can we write within our answers as well. Now always remember, I've told you this again and again, before doing an ethics question, give me a second, let me properly adjust my mic. I think this is right. So as I've said this again and again, whenever you do an ethics question, always remember that first of all, from the question itself, you have to identify whether this company that we are auditing, is it a listed company or not. Because if it is a listed company, that the safeguards that you will give would be different. Because for listed companies, there are some threats for which safeguards are a bit different. For non-listed companies, the safeguards are a bit different that you recommend within your exam. For example would be, let's say you are providing accounting and financial services. For non-listed companies, you could provide an accounting and financial services, but you had to use a separate team other than the audit team. The teams should be separate, and an appropriate reviewer who has not been within the audit team, who has not been within the team that was providing this service, should either review the audit or should either review the service that is being provided to the client. Now, if this was a listed company, then in simple terms, you are not allowed to provide this kind of service to a listed client. So the safeguards are separate in the case of listed companies and in the case of non-listed companies. So always within the question, always try to identify whether this is a listed company or not. Now, Peach Corporation has 2 separate stories within the question itself. But for us, the relevant story from where we will identify the relevant scenario, from where we will identify our threats, is this one. But in order to identify whether this is a listed company or not, always remember, the first paragraph always tells you within the question whether this is a listed company or not. So let's read it first of all. It is 1st of July 2015. You are an audit supervisor with Apricot and Corporation and have been assigned to the audit of Peach Corporation. So the name of the company is Peach Corporation and the name of our audit firm is Apricot Corporation, and I am an audit supervisor within this audit firm. Got it? Peach Corporation, what is their business? A soft drinks manufacturer, just like Pepsi, Coca-Cola. It manufactures and sells soft drinks, which sells to wholesale customers. You are currently planning the audit for the year ending 31st of August 2015. So basically, this is the year end for which this company would have made their financial statements, and we will be auditing the financial statements for this year end. And have received the following notes from the audit engagement partner. So basically all of the remaining things down have been shared to me by the audit engagement partner. Great, this is not useful for me at all. I'm just trying to find out whether this is a listed company or not. Materiality for the draft financial statements have been calculated as 153,000, which is 5% of profit before income taxes. Now, what is this materiality? You don't know, you are really confused about it because this is something new that you are seeing here. Always remember that there are things that, let me tell you that this is something that you haven't studied up till now. This is something that we will study when we go towards audit risk portion, which is basically the next chapter within your syllabus. Once we start studying audit risk, this is where you will study about materiality and how materiality is calculated and what is meant by materiality. So all of this information is not useful for us. Nowhere it has been mentioned within the question that whether it is a listed company or not a listed company. So by default, I will always consider that if in the question it is not mentioned whether it is a listed company or a non-listed company, I will always have by default thing within my mind that it is an unlisted company. If it was mentioned that it is a listed company, then my safeguards would have been for listed. But right now it is not mentioned within the question. So by default, it is an unlisted company for me. It is not listed upon the stock exchange. Hence, my safeguards are going to be for an unlisted company. Now let's move towards the scenario which is linked with our question. Now first let's read the question. The question states, give me 1 second please. Okay, so the question states, identify and explain two ethical threats which may affect the independence of Apricot Corporation, audit of Peach Corporation. So we have to identify two ethical threats. The first thing, apologies, we have to identify two ethical threats only. And the number 2 part within ethics says that for each threat, recommend an appropriate safeguard to reduce the threat to an acceptable level. So number 2, we will also have to give a safeguard against it. Again, we will follow the same criteria whenever we write down our ethical threats and safeguard questions answers within the exam as well. On one side, we'll make a table first of all. On one side, there would be the heading of threats. On the other side, there would be the heading of safeguards. And then we will follow these points to write down our answer. Got it? Now, let's read the question and try to identify from the question, first of all, what are the threats, what are the safeguards, and we will first discuss it. Obviously, within the exam, you will not discuss it with yourself. You will simply start reading the question and start writing down the answers once you have identified the threat. But this is a class, and hence in a class we have to discuss it between ourselves. So as a student, you know what is the basic thinking behind every single thread. Now let's read it. So Peach Corporation has been an audit client of Apricot Corporation for the last 15 years. So it's been 15 years since we have been auditing this company. Now a lot of the students are going to make this mistake that within familiarity thread, there is a specific circumstance or example of long association of senior partners, right? Long association of partners, EQCR, and key individuals within the audit team. There is this example. Automatically, when a student sees that, okay, we have been auditing this company for the last 15 years, there is a long association thread. I'm going to write down this thread and I'm going to write down the safeguard against it. You will not get any kind of marks for it. Never create threats or never write down your answers based upon assumptions. First, read the whole question and only write down your answers based upon things that have been properly mentioned within the scenario. Don't create your answers out of thin air within the exam, otherwise you won't get the scores for them. These are pitfalls that the examiner has made for below average student, that he wants the below average student to fall down here and write down ethical issues for this specific area and ignore the rest of the area. And the examiner would think, I have done very good within the exam, whereas he wouldn't get any kind of scores for this specific thread that he would write down. Unless and until it is mentioned that the partner has been auditing this company for the last 6 years or 7 years, if it was mentioned here, then I would have created this thread. But because nothing like that has been mentioned, I will ignore this. Let's read forward. The audit staff of Apricot and Corporation and the client of Peach Corporation have always enjoyed a meal together at the start of the final audit. So basically at the start of each audit, they go together for dinner, for lunch. Now there is a threat here. Because of gifts and hospitalities within self-interest, the situation is that this can be considered if, for example, if the client staff is paying for the audit staff when they have lunch and the audit staff does not pay for themselves, then this would have been a threat. Because obviously when you go for lunch together, for you it would be a very material amount, for them it would also be a very big amount. It would essentially be a non-trivial amount. It wouldn't be considered as a trivial amount, and this would have been a threat then. Because lunch itself, When you pay for one person, then it's not a lot of amount. But let's say if the client is paying for all the 20 or 30 different staff members that have been allocated in the audit team here, then the amount would be huge, right? It would be considered as a huge gift to the audit team. And gifts and hospitalities which are non-trivial are not allowed to be accepted from the audit client. But such thing has not been mentioned here. It hasn't been mentioned whether we pay for it or the client pays for it, whether we pay for ourselves and the client pays for themselves. But let's read forward first of all. Alan Edward, the managing director of Peach Corporation, basically managing director is also known as the CEO, has this year suggested that instead of a meal together, all the audit staff and the client staff go away for the weekend to a luxury hotel at Peach Corporation's expense. So here the examiner is saying, or the scenario is stating to us, that the CEO has suggested that we should go together, the audit team and us, we should go together on a weekend to a luxury hotel and we will stay together, and all of the expense of this luxury trip will be paid by the client themselves. They would pay this trip. And again, when we talk about the words luxury, when we talk about the words trip and going together, the client staff is also going, the audit team is also going, and the expenses of the audit team are being bared by the client themselves. This means that the client is giving you a gift now, and because it is a luxury gift, you cannot say that the amount would be of a low value. No, the amount would be of a huge value for this gift. And because of this, it cannot be considered as a non-trivial. It cannot be considered as a trivial amount. It would be a non-trivial amount. Non-trivial means it would be a huge amount, because luxury means huge expenses. So this is a case now where there is a risk here. This is the first threat that we have identified. Now we will discuss it later on how we will write it down within the exam. First, let's identify the remaining threats as well. So this is the first threat that we have identified, and the only safeguard I see against it is that because this would be a non-trivial amount, and in the future if the auditors go with them, they would feel indebted towards the client. What were the words used specifically within the fees, within the gifts and hospitality threat? The words were, acceptance of goods and services that are of a non-trivial amount can create self-interest, intimidation and familiarity threats, as the auditor may feel indebted to the client. So when I write down my answer, when I have to identify what will be the adverse impact for the audit team if there is no safeguard applied to it, the adverse impact would be that now the auditor, if the auditor accepts this luxury trip from the client, the auditor in the future, when they are auditing the financial statements, they would feel indebted towards the client, that because the client has paid so much for us, we are also debted towards them, that we should not identify huge issues within the financial statements and we should ignore them. There will be a psychological impact on the auditors themselves, that the client has done so much for us, we should not identify huge issues within the financial statements of the client. So this is the first issue that we have identified. Now moving towards the next issue. The next paragraph, sorry, not the next issue. Alan Edward, how many ethical threats do we have to identify? 2 ethical threats. Now, within this question, I'll also show you, even though the examiner is asking for 2 possible ethical threats, right? But within the questions, within the scenario itself, the options or the answers you can write will always be more than 2. The threats you can identify will always be more than what is required within the exam as well. So there will always be something extra that you can write down within the exam. But we never write down extra within the exam. We only write down that what is actually required. Writing down extra means that you are wasting your time on something that that is not going to give you scores within the exam. Only if at the end of the exam you still have 30 or 40 minutes remaining, then you can come back and write down more answers as well. So first let's read it. Alan Edward has also suggested that the current year audit fee is renegotiated to be based on a percentage of Peach Corporation's operating profit for the year. Now, this is also a threat, because under self-interest threat, we also studied an example which stated the heading of that example was contingent fee. If you remember, the heading of that example was contingent fee. And contingent fee, apologies. Contingent fee used to say that the fees of the auditor cannot be linked with the financial statements or anything of the company, because then the auditor is likely to misstate the financial statements themselves or not identify issues within the financial statements that would reduce the profit of the company, because if the profit is reduced, their fee would also be reduced because it is based on a percentage upon the company's profit. And as an auditor, contingent fee, whether it is a listed company or a non-listed company, under the code, it is not allowed to be accepted by the auditor. So this is an example of contingent fee. This is the second type of threat that we have identified. Now, if I was a student who was sitting within the exam and I have just identified two different types of threats, and the examiner has also told us identify only two ethical threats and give safeguards against them, I would not even go towards this third paragraph. I wouldn't even go towards it. When I'm actually solving this question, I would never go towards this next paragraph. I'll simply go towards my answer sheet and write down these two ethical threats as my answers and give the safeguards against them. And I'll just simply ignore this third paragraph and move towards the next requirement, the next question that is within the exam. I would never write or even read this third paragraph. Why? Because I know as a student, I only have 3 hours to solve the AA exam, right? I cannot take, let's say if this question is for 4 marks, this multiplied by 1.6, this means you only have roughly how many, let me identify, roughly how much time do you have to solve this? So 4 multiplied by 1.8 is equal to 7.2 minutes to read this question and to solve it and write down my answer as well. So I cannot waste any minute when I'm solving this question, right? I do not have enough time. Once I'm done with all of the 100 marks within the exam, once I've done all of the questions within the exam, then if I have time remaining, let's say you have 15, 20 or 30 minutes remaining, you have completed the exam within 2.5 hours or 2 hours or 15 minutes, then you can come back towards this specific portion and you know that there is still one more paragraph remaining, there might be a threat here as well. Then you can identify the threat and write it down within your answer as well as an additional threat. So if any of the first two are wrong, this would obviously help you out in that situation as well. If any of the first two are wrong, this additional threat that you will identify at the end of the exam, in the extra time that you have available, this would help you out. But never move towards writing additional things when you are not done with 100% of the exam. Never move towards writing additional things when you're not done with 100% of the exam. Now, but because this is a class, because this is a recorded lecture, obviously I'll move towards the third paragraph as well. Now, reading forward, we have identified through two threads, by the way. We are already done with the requirements of the examiner. This is something extra that we are going to do for the examiner. This year, for the first time, Apricot and Corporation has been approached by Peach Corporation. So basically, we as the audit firm has been approached by the client to do what? To help identify potential acquisition targets. Oh, basically they want to invest in some of the companies. They want to decide which company should we buy, and they are reaching out to the auditors. And the auditors are going to help them to identify, okay, these are the companies that you can acquire, or these are the companies you can invest in. This is what it means by this. Discussions are currently at an early stage and no work has been undertaken as present by the audit firm. They haven't started any kind of work upon it. The total fees in relation to the audit and other work would fall within acceptable levels in line with the ACCA's code of conduct. So basically, I wanted to come towards this last paragraph, right? Whenever you see that you are doing an audit of the company and they are coming towards you and asking you to provide them an additional service, there is always a by default threat that you can create of that 15% of the fee and 30% of the fee that we have studied within self-interest threat. Fees has a specific, the fee always has a specific fee dependency threat. This one says that for non-listed companies, if the total fee is above the 30% of the total revenue of the firm, and for listed companies, if the fee is above 15% of the total revenue of the firm, then you have to apply some of the safeguards, right? I don't need to go towards the safeguards right now, but you have to apply some safeguards. Whenever you see in a question that we are auditing this company and the company is demanding us that we provide an additional service to them as well, there is always a by default threat that you can create, which is fee dependency threat. You can always write down, because we will be providing the audit and we will also be giving them this additional service. The auditors should look for whether there would be a fee dependency threat, because the fee combined with the audit fee for the non-audit service as well would increase now, and there is always a risk that blah blah blah, the fee could be above 15% or 30% in the case of listed and unlisted companies. You can already create that threat. But in this question, the examiner has specifically stated that the total fee of this service and the audit would be below the required levels of the code of ethics within ACCA. So it would be below 30% because this is a listed company. So we don't need to create a threat for that now. If we do, we would have no marks for it. But there is a threat here, and the threat is this specific line. Apricot Corporation has been approached by Peach Corporation to help identify potential acquisition targets. This means that we would now be representing them in front of the different companies who we will have meeting with to identify which companies should be acquired by Peach Corporation. Being an auditor, we cannot represent them. This creates an advocacy threat, number one. Number two, this would also create a self-review threat. How, do you ask? How would this create a self-review threat? Once we help them identify, okay, this is the company that you should acquire, goodwill would have to be calculated. That goodwill would be based upon our suggestion that how much you should pay for this company. We will have to calculate for Apricot, and we will have to calculate for Peach and Corporation that any subsidiary that they acquire from now on, any company that they invest in, what would be the net assets of that company. In F7 financial reporting, you learned how to calculate the net assets. We would obviously calculate it for them. Whenever you have to identify potential targets for acquisition for a company, these are all the calculations that you have to do. So if all of these calculations are being done by us, and we are giving these calculations to Peach Corporation as well at the same time, Peach Corporation, when they make their consolidated financial statements, wouldn't they use our calculations, our net asset calculations, goodwill calculations, and record the goodwill based upon it? Wouldn't they use our calculations? And as an auditor, when we go back to audit Peach Corporation, when we go back to audit the statement of financial position, the consolidated financial statements, wouldn't we be auditing the same figures that we calculated? Wouldn't it be a self-review threat as well? Obviously, yes. Now, this would create two types of threats. An advocacy threat, because you would be seen representing the client, representing your audit client in front of the different types of companies that they may want to acquire. And also, this would create a self-review threat, because the calculations would be done by you as an auditor as well, and those calculations will be used within the financial statements by Peach Corporation as well. Now, these are the two separate types of threats that we have identified for this specific case. So this is the third type example. Now, always remember, if you have identified two different types of threats, like for example, in this case, we identified that this creates an advocacy and a self-review threat. This does not mean that you can create two separate answers for this specific one. In one answer, you will write down the advocacy threat. In the other answer, you will write down in the other answer, you would write down the self-review threat. No. Any situation that creates two threats, you will always write down one specific part for it. This means only one time you will identify it, and in that one time that you identify, both of these risks would be explained here. That's it. That's it. Now, as we have identified the three different types of threats in this question, now we are going to move towards our word file and try to write down the answers ourselves. Let me get ready the word file. Let me open up the word file first of all, and then I'll resume the lecture. Now, let me repeat it once again to you, that always remember, whenever we write down our questions that are relating to ethics and safeguards, we will always write down our answers in this specific format. We cannot ignore this specific format, because this format ensures that we do not miss out anything. The thing is that examiner hasn't said that what is the specific type of format that you should always follow. The examiner hasn't told us about that, right? There is no specific format. If you think that there is something else which is much better than what Sir Gohar used to teach, and I should write down my answer in some other way, if you're comfortable with that, you can go ahead with it. But the thing is that because I have taught this exam for a lot of time now, this exam, SPR and AAA, I have developed the techniques. These techniques have been developed in such a way which makes sure that you do not miss out anything within the exam. For example, if I told you the CCG answers have to be written in a certain way, it was to make sure that you do not miss out any kind of information within the exam. If you develop something on your own, if you write down the answers on your own, there are a lot of chances that you might not write down this line, that you might forget about this line, and then you wouldn't get the marks for it, obviously. So that is why I always tell you to follow the answer the way I have told you to write down the answers within the exam. If you follow them, it is assured that you will not miss anything out and you will be able to do your answers very quickly and very easily. Now, coming towards our question, this is the word file. Let's write down the name of the question first of all. The same word file that we have been using, I'll always write down my answer in the same word file so that whenever I share the file with you, it will contain all the answers that we have done within the exam. Let me see if my voice is being captured. Yes, my voice is being captured. So coming back towards our question. So the name of the question is Peach Corporation, and the part that we will be doing is part C. Part C, ethics basically. Let's bold it. Now, when I come towards my answer, I will always first of all insert a table from insert tab like this. First of all, I'll give the heading threats. Then the heading would be safeguards. And I'll press tab and it will automatically create a new tab for me, basically this button right here. You can see this button, the tab button. So I'll create this, I'll press this button and it will automatically create a new tab for me. Let me glorify my answer first of all a bit. Let's bold it, let's middle it out within the page so that our answer looks beautiful. Now, moving towards our question. Let's move towards the question first of all. So first issue that we identified was Edward, the managing director of Peach Corporation, has suggested that this year, instead of meal, all the audit staff should go away for the weekend to a luxury hotel at Peach Corporation's expense. So the issue is this one, that they have offered us that we should go together on a luxury trip in a luxury hotel, and this would create a gift and hospitality threat. Now, within the threat portion, the first thing to do was to explain the threat in your own words. First of all, just in short, one sentence, you have to explain it in your own words. So, I'm writing it down in my own words. The managing director has suggested that the audit team and the client and the team at Peach Corporation should go for a luxury trip together to a luxury hotel. Now, this is the specific issue that we identified. Now, what does this issue create? This issue is linked with gifts and hospitality, and in short, it would create, by the way, now what threats are created because of this? First of all, self-interest threat, because now you would have a financial interest, non-financial interest, that you will feel indebted towards the client, that because this company has given me a luxury trip, I should also give them a relief when I identify issues within the financial statements. This is the first thing. So self-interest threat would be created. Why it would be created? That is the third paragraph that we write down. We never write the reasons down within the second paragraph. In the second paragraph, we always explain, in the second paragraph, we always explain only the types of threats that would be created. So, second type of threat that would be created because of this situation would be what? It would be familiarity threat. Why is that the case? Because now imagine, if every single person is going together, the client staff and the audit team is going together to a luxury hotel, they would stay for, let's say, 3 or 4 days. Within these 3 or 4 days, they would become very close friends with the client's team as well. Now, if you become close friends, would you like to identify issues within the financial statements of your close friends? Obviously, no. And in the future, this is also an example that is stated within intimidation threats within the notes as well. Because if the client is giving you gifts and hospitalities at right now, in the present, in the future, they would say, so you are identifying issues within our financial statements and we were the one who gave you luxury gifts. So you're going to do this with us. So they would try to psychologically pressurize you into thinking that they did so much for you. Why are you not doing the same thing for them? Obviously. So this situation creates 3 types of different threats. Now, don't worry, within the exam, even if you write down one type of example that this creates a self-interest threat, you will still get the marks. But I always suggest write down as many threats that as it would create, but don't write down extra. Like for example, this specific example, this specific issue that is being created, don't write down self-review thread. Just because there is a thread known as self-review and advocacy, don't write it down, please, because that is not linked with this situation. That creates a bad image for you for the in front of the examiner. So writing it down now. The second step said that we have to explain in our own words what type of threat this is and what type of a threat it would create. So what type of threat, whether it would create self-interest, intimidation, and blah, 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 so on and so forth. So writing my answer down, I would write down, this would create, first of all, this is linked to gifts and hospitalities by the client and would create self-interest, comma, familiarity threat, familiarity, comma, and intimidation threat for the audit team in the future. So we always talk about future, what types of threat would occur within the future. So now, as we have written this, now we have to explain in our own words why we think that these are the risks that would be created. We have to explain this in our own words, why the self-interest would be created, why familiarity would be created, why intimidation would be created. We have to explain this in only our own words. We don't have to use the words of the code itself. We will have to explain this in our own words. As I said as well, ethics is theoretical in nature because to understand it, you have to learn a lot of the things. But once you start writing down your answers, you never write down what you have learned. You always try to make up your own answers using what you have studied within ethics. So, first of all, why a self-interest would be created? The self-interest threat would be created as the auditors. No. First of all, we will have to explain that this is a non-trivial gift that you are being paid. The luxury trip and the luxury hotel stay, when paid by Peach Corporation, would not be considered as a trivial amount because luxury trips USUA usually cost a lot, and hence this would be considered as a non-trivial amount which would make the audit team feel indebted towards the client, and the audit team may not identify issues in the financial statements thinking about this trip from the client. Now, as a student, obviously, as I said before, you only have 7.2 minutes to properly solve this answer, read it and write it down. If you start explaining familiarity, intimidation, self-interest one by one within this, that is a waste of time for you. Then the answer is going to take more than 7.5 minutes, right? It is going to take a lot of more time. It would take approximately 15 to 20 minutes. So within the exam, although if you want to mention familiarity and intimidation, you can mention it, but I wouldn't suggest that you mention it within your answers. Just mention one of the things and the one that is most directly linked to it. Now, gifts and hospitalities falls within the example of self-interest, so only mention self-interest. As a teacher, I'm doing this for you so that you may know that there are other things that it can be linked to as well and how it is linked. Now, obviously, I'll also have to explain why it would create familiarity, why it would create an intimidation threat. I will have to explain this within my own words. The familiarity threat would be created because the audit team would become too close to the Peach Corporation's team on this trip, and again would likely not identify issues in the financial statements that is prepared by the client's team because they would be close to them. And finally, the intimidation threat would be created because the intimidation threat would be created because I missed it out. I shifted to the next page. Apologies. Control X and let's paste it here. The intimidation threat would be created because the audit team, because in the future when the audit team identifies misstatements in the financial statements of Peach Corporation, then the same team of client may say that we provided you a luxury hotel trip, hence you also owe us and must ignore the issues, and the auditor may feel pressurized to agree to them. Hence, there would be this intimidation threat. Now, again, I'm repeating this. This whole answer that I've written down right here, the whole answer that I've written down, please note that this is a very, very, very professional answer. This is a very ideal answer. And as a student, if your aim is to write down ideal answers within the exam, that explains every aspect that is wrong with the scenario, you will fail your exam. Why? Because this alone is going to take me 10 minutes to write. Then I will have to write down a safeguard against it. Then I'll have to also identify and write down one more threat, then a safeguard against it. So if you are explaining too much within the exam, it is not good for you. This was just an example. But as a student, how would I do it? Let me write it down. As a student, what would I write down? All of these things that I've written, I would simply ignore them and move forward. I would never write it down. That's it. All of the red highlighted ones are the ones that I've just done it for the class. Even this one, familiarity and intimidation, even this one, I would simply just ignore it. I would not write it down. Because I know that writing these things down is just going to take extra time and I cannot finish my exam. Don't think that the examiner would cut your marks away. The examiner is not going to do it. Please remember that the examiner is not going to cut your marks simply for not writing things down because the examiner is expecting you to write down ideal answers. Obviously no, the examiner is not expecting you to write down any kind of ideal answers. Give me 1 minute, let me connect my tab first of all, because the charging is going to end. Again, where was I? I was saying that all of this is an ideal answer. All of the things that I've written down is an ideal answer. And as a student, you cannot aim for an ideal answer. You only have to aim to get the allocated marks. So for 1 marks, the one that is not red in color, the one that is black in color, the text that is black in color, only writing this down would ensure that you would get 1 marks. That's it. You only need to get 1 marks on this part, not 2, 3 marks. All of these things that I've written, this is for 3 or 4 marks. But as a teacher, I'm only writing it down so that you understand that these are also the things that you could have written down. But in the exam, you would only write down the text that is in black. You would ignore the text that is in red color. I'll do this. I'll ensure that when I'm writing my answers down, I explain every single thing and I write down every single thing. But I will always highlight the things that you do not need to write down within your exam. You can ignore them. Still, you will get the full marks. Now, coming back towards our tab, coming back towards our neat notes, our clean notes. So now we have to explain the safeguard against it. And the safeguard against it is going to be very simple. As an auditor, You are not allowed to accept gifts from clients that are non-trivial in nature, that are considered as a non-trivial amount. So obviously I cannot simply write down that I'll have to explain why this. I've already explained why this is a non-trivial amount in the in self-interest example explanation that I gave here. But obviously I'll have to write something down here as well. I can't simply straightforward write down that this should not be accepted and politely declined as it is considered non-trivial. Let's write down our answer. Let's structure our answer. We know that there is no safeguard against it that can reduce this threat to an acceptable level. So the only answer is no, we can't do it. That's it. So I'm writing my answer down and check how I write it down. Check how do I draft my answer. Not simply giving the safeguard against it, but also explaining other things against it. Now, as this luxury trip proposal by the managing director would be considered as non-trivial amount, hence the audit team should politely decline this offer from the managing director. Now this is my answer. Now if you remember, within our questions it was also stated that at the start of the audit we also enjoy a meal together. So in order to write something down extra, I can also mention this, that yes, this is something that you can do only if the auditors pay for their own meals. If the client is paying for it, then this again would not be acceptable under the code. So let's write down our answer for that as well. Although we can continue as audit team to have lunch, to have dinner with, no, what was it? What was the specific word used in this case? The word was always enjoyed a meal together. Yes, we can have this meal together. Team have the meal with the client at the start of the audit only if the audit team pays for themselves. That's it. That is my proper safeguard against it. And by the way, for familiarity, the safeguard is same. For intimidation, the safeguard is same. You cannot accept it. Always remember that within the exam, identify the threat that is directly linked with this situation, that you studied this situation in. Always identify that threat first of all. If you are unable to remember it, then you can identify other threats as well. Like this situation would also create a familiarity threat. It would also create an intimidation threat. Then you would only explain, instead of self-interest, you will only explain either the intimidation or the familiarity, the reason behind why this threat would arise. You will have to explain this in your own words, right? So the safeguard obviously would always be the same. That's it. Now moving forward towards the next portion. Now let's move forward towards the next issue that we identified. Now moving towards the second example, let's first talk about it. What was the thing that we identified? What was the threat that we identified? It was Alan Advert has also suggested. This was the threat. Give me 1 second. Alan Advert has also suggested that the current year audit fee is renegotiated to be based on a percentage of Peach Corporation's profit for the year. This specifically means that the examiner or the scenario is telling us that basically the auditor's fee should be contingent based upon something that is related with the company. And under the code, even for listed and non-listed companies, both of them, it is not allowed for the auditors to have a fee that is dependent upon something. Their fee must be based upon the number of hours or time it would take to complete the audit to gather enough evidences. It shouldn't be based upon a proper fee. Now, again, following the three-step approach, how would I write this down? So first of all, let me press tab, make a new tab for it. So identification, explanation in our own words. The managing director has suggested that the fee for the current year audit, should be based upon the profit for the year. Now, the threat that arises because of this is only one, that is self-interest threat, because this is what type of example? This was the example of, let me go towards the example first of all for you. This was the example of which we studied within self-interest threat, fee, contingent fees, this one. This is the example that is linked with, that it is linked with. And the only safeguard is that we can't do it. It is not allowed simply under the code to have any kind of fee that is linked with something. So this is contingent fee. This would be WOULD, would be a contingent fee that would create a self-interest threat. Now, let's move towards explaining in our own words why the self-interest threat would be created. Let's explain it in our own words. If the auditor accepts this fee that is based upon profits, then it is highly likely that the audit team would give me a second, that the audit team would ignore the misstatements or adjustments which would reduce the profit of the company and would then reduce the auditor's fee. Now, this is the reason why the above threat will be created, and this has been explained in our own words properly. Don't worry, I'll clear out the spelling mistakes after we are done with this question. Now, the safeguard against it. What is the safeguard? There is no safeguard that can reduce this threat to an acceptable level. First of all, this is the thing that we understand, because there is no safeguard against it. Simply, an auditor is not allowed to have any kind of fee that is dependent upon something. A contingent fee is not allowed by the auditor to be accepted. The auditor's fee should be based upon the time it would take to gather enough sufficient evidence to give an appropriate opinion to the shareholders of the company or to anyone that is providing opinion to. This is the safeguard that we will write down here. Under the code, an auditor should not accept any type of fee that is dependent upon the outcome of the company and the profits of the company. Hence, Apricot Corporation, the name of the audit firm in which we work, Apricot Corporation should simply reject this. Wait a second. Continuing our answer, we have already written down, under the code, an auditor should not accept any type of fee that is dependent upon the outcome of the company and the profits of the company. Now, again, as I said before, within the CCG section as well, this is something that is given to you by the code. This is not the recommendation here. You have to give a safeguard is a recommendation which you suggest to the auditor of that company that what you should do right now. So at the same time, you will also have to write down, hence Apricot Corporation should politely decline this offer to the managing director. And as well, a good answer would include, you have to also tell him that this is not acceptable under the code and how we take the fee. So you will write it down, the managing director, and also explain it to him that the code does not allow this kind of fee. Rather, the auditor's fee should be based, auditor's fee, apologies, I missed the word. Auditor's fee should be based upon the time it would take to complete the audit appropriately. So by using this, it already means we have to gather enough evidences and it would take a lot of time, and the time that it would take, the fee should represent the time that it would take us to properly do the audit. So we are done with this safeguard as well. Now in this safeguard, I've only written down things that you as a student would also have written down within the exam. I've not written down anything extra. And by the way, within this safeguard and within this threat, there was nothing extra that could have been written down. Coming towards the exam kit now. Within the exam kit, the next thing that we identified was Apricot Corporation has been approached by Peach Corporation to identify potential acquisition targets. Now, because of this, I said that two types of threats would be created. First of all, it would be an advocacy threat because you would be representing the client in front of the potential companies that they could acquire. You would have meetings with them and it could be seen that you are representing your audit client in front of them, which is not allowed under the code. Number two, this would also create a self-review threat as well, because the figures and calculations that would be done by you, this would be the same calculations that would be used by this company you are auditing, Peach Corporation, in their consolidated financial statements as well. Hence, this would also create a self-review threat at the same time. Now, as a student, again, you will write down only one of the answers. And the most appropriate answer here is not advocacy, because this would be a secondary impact. First thing is first, it would create a self-review threat. Now, because this is an unlisted company, now you can't say that you should not do it because you would be seen representing, and under the code it is not allowed to represent the client. This is not a listed company. Remember that. This is an unlisted company, a non-listed company. This is not traded upon the stock exchange. The shares of this company are not traded publicly. Because of this, our recommendation, the safeguard that we are going to recommend will be a bit different. That you can provide this service, but make sure you use a separate team that is not part of the audit team. And before the opinion is given, the audit opinion is given, someone who is not part of the audit team and the service provided should review either the service or the audit that is being done. A pre-issuance review should be given on the audit, and this would be our recommendation. If you can use separate teams, you can provide this service. So coming towards our answer, first of all, let me press tab and add a new tab here. So explaining it, first of all, we will have to identify this issue in our own words. And how will I write it down? Apricot Corporation has approached Peach Corporation to identify potential acquisition targets. First of all, I will write it down in my own words. The auditors at Apricot Corporation have been asked by the team at Peach Corporation to help them identify companies for acquisition. So basically, purchasing the companies or purchasing a new subsidiary. This is the identification. Now I have to link it with the appropriate type of threat: self-review threat and advocacy threat. This would create, now I don't remember the example myself. As I said when I was explaining the way that you write down your answers, the second point, if you don't remember the type of example, it's completely fine. That is not a big issue. But you have to remember what type of threat it would create. So the threat that would be created, this would create a self-review threat and an advocacy threat as well. Now let me show you, if you want to explain two things, the self-review and advocacy threat, in a short amount of time, how would you do it as a student? Let's say you decide, no sir, you told us that write only one of the examples down in the first case. In the second case, you actually wrote just one example down. Now also teach us the case where you can write down both of the things, explain both of the things in the same paragraph at the same time. Let me do it for you. So you also know how do you explain two things at the same time within the exam as well, if you want to do it, because you think that it would be beneficial for you. So let's write it down. So self-review and advocacy. If the auditors provide this service, then they would be meeting with the acquisition targets, potential acquisition companies. Hence, it would be seen as Apricot Corporation is representing Peach Corporation, and this would create, no, let's not write it down, Peach Corporation. And at the same time, because the calculations and the work done by Apricot Corporation would be used in subsequent. What is meant by subsequent? After acquisition, the financial statements that would be made. This means subsequently. After this is done, the next things are known as subsequently. This is a proper grammar in English. If some of you don't know about English, this is how you write it down. Subsequent would be used in subsequent financial statements, subsequent consolidated financial statements, consolidated financial statements by Peach Corporation. Hence, this would create the above mentioned threats. Now, instead of increasing my answer, which would take a lot of time, mentioning every threat that it would create a self-review threat and an advocacy threat, I simply mentioned the above mentioned threats because I've already mentioned the threats right here, and both of the reasons I've given them in the same paragraph as well, which you can also do within the exam. Now, what is the appropriate safeguard for it? If this was a listed company, I would have written down again the same thing which I've written down above. These types of services cannot be provided by the auditor under the code as this is a listed company. Hence, the auditor should politely reject this offer and should tell them that because this would create a self-review threat and that there is no safeguard to reduce this threat to an acceptable level, we are resigning or we are basically rejecting politely this offer. This should be rejected. But because this is a non-listed company, my safeguard would be different. As Peach Corporation is not a listed company, hence, Apricot Corporation can accept this non-audit service, but safeguards such as using separate teams for both audit and the service provided will have to be used, and at the same time an appropriate person who is not a part of audit team and the service providing team should review either the audit or the service provided before the audit opinion is issued. Audit opinion is issued by the audit team. That is the appropriate safeguard now that I've given to the audit team, that you should do these things if you want to provide this service to this audit client of ours, which is Peach Corporation. And this is our question number 1 that is done. The name of the question was Peach Corporation, and we are done with this question. We have solved this question in the way that we discussed within the lecture as well. We have made sure that we follow the points that I've given to you. We have not gone out of our way to write down our answers. These points ensure that you do not miss anything out within the exam and that you can ensure that you gain full marks. Now, within the exam, as if I was a student, the examiner only asked for 2 ethical threats. I would have only written down the first 2. I would have ignored even the 3rd paragraph. I would have simply moved forward towards the next question within the exam. Once I had enough time remaining, I would come back, review all of my paper, and if I had enough time, I would review the 3rd paragraph as well and identify the threat and write down the threat as well. But as a student, when you're solving the actual exam, you do not write down anything extra because it would only take extra time, which is not going to be any beneficial to you. This would not generate any benefit to you simply because the time is very short within the exam. 3 hours is not allowed for the audit exam. So you have to make sure that you solve 100% of the exam for 100 marks, not more than 100 marks. If you have any more time remaining, then you come back and write anything extra down that you identified. So we are done with this specific question as well. If you have any issues, please always remember that I'm always available upon WhatsApp to answer any of the issues for you, to answer anything that is creating an issue for you, and we can also keep a live class for that as well. Take care, and we will continue. We will do other questions as well from the next lecture onwards. Take care, tata, and bye-bye.